There's a phone call every adult child secretly dreads receiving. The one that starts with a shaky voice saying, "It's not an emergency, but I need to tell you something." Today's story is about a woman who received that exact call at 41 years old, and the decision that followed it, one that quietly rearranged every plan she thought she'd already settled into. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. On this channel, we tell honest stories about family, sacrifice, and the invisible weight so many people carry while trying to hold everything together at once. This particular story may change the way you look at the people quietly stretched between two generations. Her name was Elaine Porter. She was 41, married to a patient man named David, raising two children, Sophie, 13, and Max, 9, and working as a regional sales director for a medical supply company, a job she'd spent 15 years building from the ground up. Her life, by most measures, looked exactly the way she'd planned it to look. Right down to the color-coded planner on her kitchen counter and the framed family photos lining the hallway she walked past every morning without really seeing anymore. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, her mother's voice cracked through the phone in a way Elaine had never heard before. "The doctor found something," her mother, Ruth, said carefully. "It's Parkinson's. He says it's progressing faster than he'd like." Elaine sat down slowly on her kitchen floor, phone pressed against her ear, watching Max's soccer cleats scattered near the back door, as though the ordinary details of her life could somehow anchor her against what she was hearing. Ruth lived alone, 300 miles away, in the same small house Elaine had grown up in, ever since Elaine's father had passed 6 years earlier. There was no one else nearby to help, no siblings. Elaine was an only child, just Ruth, alone in a house with stairs she could no longer safely manage, and a diagnosis that would only get harder from here. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly. The hardest decisions rarely arrive with obvious answers. Elaine spent the following 3 weeks researching assisted living facilities near her mother's town, calling home health agencies, running numbers that never quite worked, no matter how many times she rearranged them. Quality care, it turned out, cost more than Ruth's modest pension could cover, and even the best facilities couldn't offer what Elaine kept circling back to in the middle of the night. Her mother, alone, frightened, in a room full of strangers, at exactly the moment she needed family most. She made spreadsheets late at night, after David and the kids had gone to sleep, comparing monthly costs, drive times, insurance coverage, and wait lists, as though enough data might eventually reveal an answer that didn't require anyone to sacrifice anything. It never did. Every option she found required someone to give something up. Money they didn't have, distance they couldn't manage, or a version of family closeness Elaine wasn't willing to trade away, simply because the alternative was more convenient. The conversation with David happened on a Sunday evening, after the kids had gone to bed. Elaine laid out every option she'd researched, her voice growing tighter with each sentence, until she finally said the thing she'd been avoiding saying out loud for days. "I think we need to move her in with us, or move closer to her. I don't think I can do this from 300 miles away." David was quiet for a long moment. "What about your job?" he finally asked, not unkindly, simply naming the obvious complication neither of them wanted to address first. Elaine didn't have an answer that night, but over the following weeks, as Ruth's tremors grew more noticeable during their video calls, as small tasks like buttoning a coat began taking her visibly longer, the answer slowly became unavoidable. Elaine requested a transfer to a smaller regional territory, closer to Ruth's town, a move that would cut her salary by nearly a third and eliminate any realistic path toward the promotion she'd been working toward for 2 years. Her company approved the transfer. They did not approve keeping her at her current level of responsibility. If you're still watching this story, don't just feel sorry for Elaine. Ask yourself something honest. How many decisions in your own life have quietly been shaped by love, in ways nobody outside your family would ever fully understand from the outside looking in? The move itself took place over a difficult August weekend. Sophie, 13, and deeply attached to her friend group, cried angrily in the moving truck, blaming her mother for uprooting her entire social life for no reason. Max, younger and more adaptable, mostly worried about whether the new house would have a yard big enough for his dog. David took a demotion of his own, transferring to a smaller branch of his accounting firm, quietly absorbing a pay cut neither of them discussed openly with the kids, not wanting to add financial anxiety to an already difficult transition. They settled into a house 2 streets over from Ruth's, close enough that Elaine could check on her every morning before work, and every evening after picking up the kids from school. The first several months were brutally difficult in ways Elaine hadn't fully anticipated, even after all her research. Ruth's condition fluctuated unpredictably. Some days sharp and mostly independent, other days requiring help with tasks as basic as preparing a simple lunch. Elaine learned to recognize the specific tremor pattern that meant Ruth needed her medication adjusted before her neurologist even mentioned it during their next appointment. She learned other things too. Things no article on caregiving had prepared her for. How to help her mother button a blouse without making the moment feel humiliating for either of them. How to sit through a doctor's appointment, translating medical jargon into language Ruth wouldn't feel condescended by. How to grieve small losses in real time, like the afternoon Ruth could no longer safely knit, a hobby she'd practiced for nearly 50 years. Elaine found the abandoned knitting basket in a closet months later, and sat on the floor holding it for almost 20 minutes, before she could bring herself to close the door again. Here's the sentence worth pausing on. The one Elaine wrote in a journal she started keeping that first winter, on a night she genuinely wondered if she'd made an enormous mistake. I didn't choose this because it was convenient. I chose it because someday, I want to know I showed up when it actually mattered, not just when it was easy. The sandwich Elaine found herself in tightened with each passing season. Sophie needed help navigating a difficult friendship breakup. Right around the same week, Ruth had a frightening fall in her bathroom, requiring an emergency room visit that kept Elaine awake until nearly 4 in the morning. Max needed a ride to soccer practice at the exact hour Ruth's physical therapist arrived for a session Elaine had promised to sit in on. There were entire weeks where Elaine felt she was disappointing everyone simultaneously. A distracted mother, an inconsistent daughter, a wife too exhausted most nights for meaningful conversation with David, who never once complained, but occasionally looked at her with a tiredness she recognized reflected in her own face. She kept a shared calendar, color-coded by person. Blue for Sophie's activities, green for Max's, yellow for Ruth's appointments. And there were weeks the calendar looked less like a schedule and more like a battle map of competing obligations, each one legitimate, none of them able to simply wait. David eventually took over grocery runs, and most dinners entirely, quietly rearranging his own work hours without complaint, understanding that some seasons of marriage require one partner to simply absorb more, so the other doesn't collapse under the weight of it. One particularly hard evening, nearly a year into the arrangement, Elaine sat in her car outside Ruth's house after an exhausting physical therapy appointment, unable to make herself go inside just yet. She called her old college roommate, Priya, someone she rarely had time to talk to anymore, and simply cried for several minutes without being able to fully explain why. "I don't even know what I'm grieving," Elaine admitted eventually. "My mom's still here. I should just be grateful for that." Priya, who had lost her own mother 2 years earlier, was quiet for a moment before answering gently. "You're allowed to grieve the life you had before this, even while you're grateful for the time you still have with her." Those two things aren't in competition with each other. That single sentence, Elaine later said, gave her permission to stop feeling guilty for being exhausted, a permission she desperately needed, but hadn't realized she was withholding from herself. Slowly, over the following 2 years, a new rhythm emerged, imperfect, but sustainable. Elaine learned to ask for help more directly, instead of quietly absorbing every responsibility herself. She joined a small local caregiver support group that met on Wednesday evenings at the community center. Initially reluctant, eventually grateful, for a room full of people who understood exhaustion she didn't have to explain from scratch. Sophie, once resentful of the move, eventually grew close to her grandmother in a way that surprised everyone, spending afternoons after school, teaching Ruth simple exercises her physical therapist recommended, the two of them developing an easy companionship that hadn't existed when Ruth lived 300 miles away. Max started calling Ruth's house Grandma's second living room, treating her couch as an extension of his own home, leaving his shoes by her door, the same way he left them by his own. David, for his part, quietly built a friendship with Ruth that Elaine hadn't fully expected. He fixed the loose railing on her porch steps without being asked, drove her to appointments when Elaine's work schedule made it impossible, and developed an easy habit of sitting with her on Sunday afternoons, the two of them arguing amiably over crossword puzzles, while Elaine caught up on laundry nearby, grateful for a marriage sturdy enough to absorb this kind of unglamorous, ongoing sacrifice without cracking under the pressure. Ruth, for her part, never fully stopped worrying about the sacrifice her daughter had made. On a quiet afternoon, roughly 2.5 years into the arrangement, sitting together on Ruth's porch while Elaine helped braid her thinning hair, Ruth finally said what had clearly been sitting in her chest for a long while. "You gave up your career for me. I know you did. I've watched you pretend it doesn't bother you, but I know what that promotion would have meant." Elaine considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I didn't give up my career, Mom. I redirected it. And honestly, I think I'm better at my job now than I ever was before, because I finally understand what actually matters when everything else gets stripped away. You didn't take anything from me. You gave me the chance to prove to myself what kind of daughter and what kind of mother I actually wanted to become." Ruth's tremors had steadied somewhat with treatment by that point, though the disease continued its slow progression the way Parkinson's inevitably does. But something else had steadied too, a relationship between mother and daughter that had grown deeper and more honest than it had been in decades, forged specifically through the difficulty neither of them would have chosen on their own. Elaine's company, noticing her steady performance despite the smaller territory, eventually offered her a new regional position, one that allowed remote flexibility she hadn't had in her previous role. It wasn't the exact promotion she'd once been chasing before Ruth's diagnosis, but it came with something her old path never would have offered: a schedule built entirely around the family she'd chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to prioritize. So here's something worth sitting with tonight. Is there someone in your own life, quietly caught between caring for the people who raised them and raising the people who now depend on them? The sandwich generation rarely gets thanked publicly for what it carries, mostly because the sacrifice happens in ordinary, unglamorous moments nobody photographs. A canceled meeting, a missed promotion, a quiet decision made at a kitchen table that nobody outside the family will ever fully understand. There's no ceremony for it, no plaque, no applause. Just a series of small, exhausting choices, made over and over, that eventually add up to a life reshaped entirely around love. Elaine still keeps that journal from her first difficult winter, the one where she wrote about showing up when it actually mattered. She's added new entries since, some frustrated, some deeply grateful, most somewhere honestly in between. On one recent page, she wrote about a small moment that stayed with her longer than expected: watching Sophie, now 16, patiently help Ruth into the car for a doctor's appointment, without being asked. The same unhurried patience Elaine herself had once had to learn, under far more difficult circumstances. It struck her that whatever her children were absorbing from watching this season unfold might end up mattering more than any single sacrifice she'd made along the way. But she says she's never once regretted the decision that reshaped her entire life. That Tuesday afternoon, phone pressed to her ear, sitting on her kitchen floor beside a pair of scattered soccer cleats. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's quietly stretched between caring for aging parents and raising their own children. Sometimes the hardest, most invisible sacrifices are also the ones that end up mattering most. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between your career and caring for someone you love? And how did you make peace with that decision? Whatever you chose, chances are nobody outside your closest circle ever fully understood what that choice actually cost you. And chances are you never once needed them to, because you didn't make it for their approval in the first place. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.